Welcome back, everybody. Ready to dive into some more fascinating research.
Always. What are we looking at today?
Today we're tackling insulin,
Okay.
glucose, and fat loss.
Ooh. Sounds interesting already.
Oh, it definitely is.
Yeah.
This article is going to challenge pretty much everything you thought you knew about all three.
I'm intrigued. Who's the author and what's the article?
All right, so the article is Insulin, Glucose Toxicity, and Fat Loss by Joachim Bartoll.
Okay.
It was just published on October 29th, 2024.
Very recent.
Yeah, and Bartoll, he's a pretty strong advocate for a fat-based metabolism.
I see.
And he really doesn't hold back in his critique of the way we usually think about carbs and insulin.
Yeah, I've seen some of his work, and he definitely has some strong opinions.
You could say that again.
Especially about challenging the status quo in nutrition.
Exactly.
It seems like everyone has a different idea about what's healthy these days.
Oh, absolutely. And Bartoll, he jumps right in and says that most of the research on insulin that we have is fundamentally flawed.
Interesting. Why does he think that?
He argues it's because most of it is based on people who eat carbohydrates regularly as part of their normal diet.
Okay, so he's suggesting that our modern carb-heavy diets are distorting our understanding of basic human metabolism.
Exactly.
Oh.
And he claims that this creates a really skewed understanding of how insulin really functions.
I'm starting to see why you said this article would challenge everything I thought I knew. So what does he propose as an alternative then?
He says that humans are evolutionarily designed for a fat-based metabolism.
A fat-based metabolism.
I'm listening.
Yeah, so to understand why this is so radical, we need to kind of think about how our ancestors would have had access to energy.
Right, going way back.
Yeah, so imagine a hunter-gatherer society.
Okay.
They didn't have consistent access to carbs like we do today.
That makes sense, like no grocery stores or anything.
Exactly.
Their diets would have been higher in, well, fats and protein from animal sources, and then whatever seasonal plants they could forage, right?
That makes sense. So if their diets were lower in carbohydrates, their bodies would have had to adapt to use fat as a primary fuel source.
And that's exactly what Bartoll says happened.
Okay.
He says that carbohydrates are essentially toxic to our systems.
Toxic. Is he saying carbohydrates are poison?
Well, he uses the term toxic, but I think what he's getting at is this idea that constantly eating carbohydrates creates this state of metabolic stress in our bodies.
Interesting.
Yeah, and he uses this really interesting analogy to illustrate it.
Okay, I like analogies.
He describes insulin as an emergency response system.
An emergency response system. Okay, tell me more.
So think about it. In a fat-fueled state, insulin would just be regulating the, small amount of glucose our body naturally produces, right?
Right.
But when we eat a meal full of carbs, it's like hitting the panic button for our bodies. I get it.
Right. We suddenly get flooded with glucose, and insulin has to kick into overdrive to deal with it.
So he's saying that instead of insulin being this, evil thing that's making us fat, it's actually trying to protect us from all that extra glucose.
Exactly. And he has a name for what's actually happening.
Ooh, what's that?
Glucose toxicity.
Glucose toxicity.
He argues that it's not insulin itself that prevents fat loss, but actually the elevated blood glucose levels.
So it's like our bodies are constantly in this state of glucose overload.
Yes.
And that's interfering with our ability to burn fat effectively.
Exactly.
That's a pretty interesting way to look at it.
It really flips the script on how we typically view insulin resistance, right?
It really does.
And he goes even further and says that this constant flood of glucose actually damages our cells.
Our cells? Like, how?
He says it especially damages their ability to effectively take in glucose and then store it.
That raises a good question.
What happens when our cells can't store glucose effectively? Like, where does all that excess glucose go?
That's where things start to go really wrong, according to Bartoll.
Oh, no.
He says that when our cells are overwhelmed with glucose, a specific receptor called the GIP receptor gets disrupted.
GIP receptor?
Yeah.
Does that stand for glucose-dependent insulinotropic polypeptide?
You got it.
Wow, you're really on top of this stuff.
Well, I did my homework for this one.
Wow, fair enough.
So the GIP receptor, it plays a key role in signaling cells to take in glucose and store it as glycogen, which is like our body's storage form of glucose.
Gotcha.
But when the cells are just constantly bombarded with glucose, this receptor can become less effective or even damaged.
So it's like the communication system between insulin and the cells gets jammed, right?
Yeah.
Insulin's like, hey, let glucose in. But the cells aren't getting the message.
Yeah,
it's just full.
Exactly. And if those cells can't store any more glucose as glycogen, Bartoll says the excess glucose basically has nowhere to go but to be stored as body fat.
This is where Bartoll's argument starts to get really interesting.
Does it?
Yeah. He's saying that what we usually call insulin resistance might actually be a protective mechanism.
A protective mechanism.
Yeah. He claims that as cells become damaged from, years of this glucose overload, they become less responsive to insulin. It's not that they're ignoring insulin, but they're trying to protect themselves from taking in even more glucose.
Wow. I never thought of it that way.
Right. Because that could further damage them or even kill them.
So it's not that the cells are resistant to insulin, but they're resistant to taking in more glucose.
Exactly. It's like they're putting up a shield, right?
That's a good way to put it.
To protect themselves.
Okay, so...
He actually uses the term glucose resistance.
Instead of insulin resistance?
Yeah, it's a subtle but important distinction.
Okay.
And this perspective really challenges the traditional narrative around obesity.
How so?
Well, Bartoll argues that obesity isn't simply a matter of willpower or laziness, but rather a consequence of this cellular damage caused by, excess glucose consumption.
Oh, interesting.
The cells are so overloaded that they can't function properly.
Right.
And the excess glucose gets shunted into fat storage.
It's like our dietary choices have consequences we don't even realize.
It really is.
He also mentions fatty liver disease as another consequence of all this.
Yeah.
How does that fit into this whole picture?
So the liver,
it's
responsible for processing and storing glucose.
Right.
When it becomes overwhelmed, it starts to accumulate fat.
Right.
This can lead to inflammation and damage.
Oh, no.
And eventually, fatty liver disease.
So it sounds like he's making a pretty strong case for reducing our carb intake. But what about improving insulin sensitivity?
Okay, so he actually dismisses the idea that weight loss itself improves insulin sensitivity.
Oh, really?
Yeah. He believes the key is in how you lose weight.
Okay.
If you lose weight by simply reducing calories, but continue to eat a lot of carbs, you're not addressing the root cause.
Which is?
The glucose overload.
So it's not just about the number on the scale.
No.
It's about the underlying metabolic changes.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
To really improve what he calls glucose resistance, we need to reduce our carb intake significantly.
Okay.
And prioritize fat and protein.
Interesting.
He believes that by lowering the glucose load, we allow those damaged cells to recover.
Oh, wow.
And start functioning properly again.
It's like giving those cells a chance to breathe after years of just being bombarded.
Exactly. And then as those cells recover, they become more responsive to insulin, which in turn helps regulate blood sugar levels.
This all comes back to his main argument.
Yes.
Focus on the input.
If you want to improve your health and lose fat,
you
need to change what you're eating.
And he doesn't stop there.
What else does he say?
He also takes aim at the idea of genetic predisposition.
Genetic predisposition.
When it comes to metabolic health.
Okay, I'm listening.
He strongly disagrees with the notion that some people are just genetically destined to struggle with their weight. For their metabolic function.
So he's basically saying that while genetics plays a role, our dietary choices have a much greater impact.
Then we realize that's a powerful message of, hope and personal empowerment.
Yeah, but it's important to remember this is just one perspective on a very complex issue.
That's very true.
Absolutely.
So as we move into the final part of our deep dive,
yeah.
let's explore this idea of genetic predisposition a bit further. Bartoll seems to have some pretty strong opinions on it.
He does.
And I'm curious to hear how his perspective might challenge our current understanding of this interplay between, you know, genes, diet, and metabolic health.
Right.
We've been talking about how maybe we've been pointing the finger at insulin all along.
Yeah.
When the real issue is how our bodies are dealing with glucose.
Right.
Bartoll even pushes back against this idea that some people are just, you know, genetically predisposed to be worse at this whole thing than others.
What's his take on that?
Well, he says this concept of different genotypes.
Genotypes meaning like
variations in our genes.
Yeah, that affect how we metabolize carbs.
Mm-hmm.
He thinks it's a bit of a distraction.
A distraction? How so?
He thinks it distracts us from the bigger picture.
Which is?
That we're all eating a diet that's basically mismatched with our evolutionary blueprint.
So instead of getting hung up on these individual variations,
we should be looking at what we all have in common.
Exactly. Like taking a step back from the hyper-personalized nutrition advice and looking at, what our ancestors ate for most of human history.
Interesting.
Bartoll believes that by cutting down on carbs and prioritizing fats and protein, we can basically reset our metabolism.
Reset our metabolism.
Yeah, and get back to that more natural way of eating.
That's a pretty big claim.
It is. He's essentially saying that your genes don't matter as much as aligning your diet with what humans evolved to eat.
Wow.
He actually views this whole modern emphasis on individualized diets based on genetics as like a distraction from that core issue.
And the core issue being?
That we're all eating way too many carbohydrates.
That's definitely a different way of looking at things.
It is. This has to be one of the most thought-provoking deep dives we've done.
It really is.
And while I think Bartoll's arguments are super interesting, it's important to remember this is just one perspective.
Yeah, we always have to keep that in mind.
Of course. And it's worth saying that even if Bartoll is right, making big dietary changes should always be done in consultation with a, qualified healthcare professional.
Of course.
All right, well, we've covered so much ground today.
We have.
Glucose toxicity, this idea of insulin as an emergency response system.
Right.
And this radical notion that maybe our genes aren't the metabolic destiny we thought they were.
Yeah, this deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about.
Me too. Any final takeaways for our listener before we wrap up?
I think Bartoll's article really reminds us that we should question everything.
Question everything.
Yeah. Don't just blindly accept conventional wisdom.
Especially about our health.
Exactly. Do your research, explore different perspectives, and most importantly, listen to your body.
That's great advice. This has definitely given me a lot to ponder too.
Good.
And to our listeners, we hope this deep dive has inspired you to learn more about nutrition and metabolism.
I hope so too.
Keep those questions coming. Yes. And we'll see you on our next deep dive.
Insulin Glucose Toxicity and Fat Loss by Joachim Bartoll, October 29, 2024. Sent to Kindle. Today we'll take a look at Anabolic Minds, a quite popular bodybuilding and supplement website very similar to T-Nation, but with fewer advertisement articles and less pushing for toxic and useless supplements. While their article on the carnivore diet vs. the Mediterranean diet was a total mess of being totally clueless of bioavailability and what nutrients actually are, their latest article on insulin is a perfect example of getting some things right while being totally misled by backwards thinking and pseudoscience because they do not understand the basics of human physiology and biology. As for this example of insulin and fat loss, it all comes back to the failure to understand and acknowledge that humans are built for running on a fat metabolism and that we are supposed to be in ketosis most of the time and very rarely, if ever, consume toxic carbohydrates. That scenario should be the starting point when evaluating any physiological response, including insulin. However, as the modern society has been deceived into consuming these toxic and cheap carbohydrates and most people run on a glucose metabolism, and thus are extremely unhealthy, everything is turned on its head as every single study with someone who is used to consuming carbohydrates becomes flawed and totally worthless, and they have to make up lies after lies to explain their findings. Let's see what Anabolic Minds put together for us on the subject of insulin and fat loss. Insulin is a vital hormone that plays a central role in the regulation of glucose metabolism and energy storage in the human body. It is commonly associated with diabetes management, but its functions extend beyond blood sugar regulation. Actually, since we are meant to run on a fat metabolism, while only producing the glucose we need through gluconeogenesis, insulin operates on a sliding scale. In normal conditions, when we only consume fat and protein, just enough insulin is made to make sure that the glucose we produce through gluconeogenesis is used by the correct tissues. And since we manufacture our own glucose depending on the immediate need, our body will never manufacture more than is needed, which means that blood glucose levels will never go above a certain threshold, as it is extremely toxic and damaging to all other tissues. Insulin also aids in protein synthesis, energy production, and so on. However, if you for some reason consume carbohydrates, an unnatural amount of insulin is produced and released to speed up glucose disposal as all carbohydrates turn into glucose, which again, is extremely toxic and damaging to all soft tissues. This is not a normal occurring response, as we are not meant to consume carbohydrates. It's an emergency response critical for survival, or the elevated blood glucose from the carbohydrates would kill you. This is critical to understand. When glucose levels reach a certain point, the saturation becomes too great and all soft tissues start to take damage. That is why blood glucose is so tightly regulated in a healthy human, and why we release extra insulin if we happen to consume toxic carbohydrates. It's purely survival, an emergency stress response, and that is never healthy. And that is why insulin has become associated with diabetes, a condition where your cells have taken so much damage from repeatedly elevated blood glucose that they no longer can store glucose as glycogen, and blood glucose remains elevated for longer periods of time, doing even more damage. It has absolutely nothing to do with insulin, or resistance to insulin, it's simply accumulated damage from abusing your body, fueling it with toxic garbage. A key question that has been explored over the years is whether insulin inhibits fat loss and how it impacts the body's ability to burn fat. The relationship between insulin and fat metabolism is complex and involves various physiological processes. Insulin is part of the emergency system when you consume carbohydrates. If you actually understand the physiology, it's extremely logical. If you consume something that raises, in this case, blood glucose, which is extremely toxic and needs to be kept in a very narrow range, it's hardly a surprise that all other energy-giving metabolisms are temporarily shut down in order to focus all efforts on lowering that toxic glucose. It would be madness if the body continued to use fat for fuel when it has an abundance of glucose, something that is also doing damage to tissues and organs. So, of course, fat metabolism is shut down after you consume carbohydrates. However, that is not the fault of insulin, that is the fault of elevated blood glucose. Insulin is only a hormone released to increase the use, absorption, and storage of that blood glucose to save your life. Insulin is produced by the pancreas and is responsible for helping cells absorb glucose from the bloodstream, which they use for energy or store as fat. When insulin levels are elevated, the body tends to store more fat, particularly in adipose tissue, which leads to the concern that insulin might inhibit fat loss. This assumption is partially true, but the actual mechanism is multifaceted. Again, this is part of the survival mechanism when consuming carbohydrates. The elevated levels of blood glucose needs to be neutralized to minimize the damage it will cause. Some of it is burnt by spontaneous activity, as seen in children, some of it is stored as muscle glycogen, and some of it is stored as body fat. Again, that is only a function of insulin in order to minimize tissue damage and to save your life. One of the fundamental ways insulin influences fat metabolism is by inhibiting lipolysis, the process where fats are broken down into free fatty acids to be used as energy. Yes, I already explained this. Your body needs to focus on lowering that toxic blood glucose by any means necessary. Turning off the usage of fat as fuel is one way to upregulate the use of glucose as fuel instead. Again, critical for survival and minimizing the damage. When insulin levels are high, such as after consuming carbohydrates, the body prioritizes glucose oxidation over fat oxidation. This phenomenon has been shown in various studies examining metabolic pathways in both humans and animals. It's not a phenomenon. It's basic physiology. It's a reaction to poisoning. Your body will always prioritize dealing with what is the current most dangerous threat to your health and life. While glucose is an important fuel for some tissues, it's meant to be produced by the body in precise quantities. Adding it from external sources causes acute poisoning as the concentration of glucose reaches toxic levels. Moreover, in a 2003 study by Goodpaster et al., it was shown that enhanced fat oxidation is associated with improved insulin sensitivity. The research demonstrated that weight loss, combined with exercise, increased the rate of fat oxidation, which contributed to better insulin sensitivity in obese individuals. Goodpaster, Katcharos, and Kelly, 2003. Thus, while insulin might initially inhibit fat oxidation, improving insulin sensitivity through physical activity can lead to an overall enhancement in fat metabolism. In this sense, improved insulin sensitivity is simply the result of removing some of the toxic glucose load on the body for a time, giving it a chance to heal a little. That in turn will make some tissues able to store more glucose as glycogen again. It has nothing to do with sensitivity to any hormone. This can be accomplished by more exercise, which uses glucose and glycogen as fuel, or by lowering your carbohydrate intake for a while, thus lowering the glucose load on all tissues. It's not complicated. It's simple logic. The role of insulin in fat storage and obesity is often highlighted in discussions about insulin's inhibitory effects on fat loss. GIP, glucose-dependent insulinotropic polypeptide, which stimulates insulin secretion in response to nutrient intake, plays a significant role in fat storage. In a study published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, Chi et al. 2012, explored how different genetic variants of the GIP receptor affected body weight and insulin resistance. They found that certain genotypes responded better to low-fat diets in terms of weight loss and improvements in insulin sensitivity, suggesting that dietary fat content can modify how insulin functions with regard to fat storage. Chi et al. 2012. And here is where the backwards thinking kicks in, when they try to explain findings using their inverted and false model of people following a balanced diet with carbohydrates. totally ignoring the fact that humans are obligated hypercarnivores and only meant to consume fat and protein, as in animal-based foods, and to run on a fat metabolism. While they love to blame genetics for everything they can't explain, the fact remains, there are no different genotypes or any of that made-up silly pseudoscience nonsense. All humans have the same blueprint. What actually happens is what I have already described many times, that repeated and prolonged elevated blood glucose damages the cells, and as cellular damage accumulates, cells will become unable to store glucose or they would collapse and die. This stage is characterized by the shutdown of the glucagon-like peptide 1, GIP, receptor. It's not insulin resistance, it's glucose resistance. It's the last stage survival mechanism for the cell. Actually, there is even some evidence that the glucose itself damages the cells to such a degree that the receptor itself is damaged or even destroyed, making the cell totally unresponsive to insulin. In other words, a reduced response to insulin, whether it's from GIP receptor inhibition or not, is simply from accumulated damage done to the cells by elevated levels of blood glucose from consuming carbohydrates regularly for long periods of time. It's not more complicated than that. Insulin resistance, a condition where cells do not respond properly to insulin, is commonly seen in obesity. Insulin resistance results in higher circulating insulin levels, which further promote fat storage. Yes, as the cells become so damaged that they no longer can store glucose as glycogen, the only remaining option is to store the excess glucose as body fat. And that will accelerate fat storage, leading to obesity. Still, it's not the fault of insulin, it's the accumulated damage from consuming carbohydrates. The cells are shutting down or they would die. Also, obese people tend to be much less active, burning even less glucose as energy. After this they mention fatty liver, which simply is the result of damage to the liver from prolonged elevated blood glucose. Again, it has nothing to do with insulin. Insulin sensitivity refers to how effectively cells respond to insulin. Improved insulin sensitivity means that lower amounts of insulin are required to process glucose, which has implications for fat loss. When insulin sensitivity improves, such as through physical activity or weight loss, the body is better able to switch between fat and carbohydrate metabolism, promoting fat oxidation. The cells can only respond to insulin if they are healthy and can actually store glucose as glycogen. What they call insulin resistance or insulin insensitivity is simply an increase in cells that are so damaged that they can't store glucose or they would die. Hence, these cells no longer respond to insulin out of survival. And weight loss does not improve this. It's what you do to achieve weight loss that improves this. It's crucial to make this distinction. When you lose weight, you do it by eating less and perhaps moving more. By eating less, there will be less toxic glucose in the blood, and by moving a bit more, some of the toxic glucose you still get from carbohydrates will be used as fuel. Both scenarios mean less glucose and less damage. This also means that some cells can recover and heal and once again store glucose as glycogen. Yes, it's that simple. It really has nothing to do with insulin, it's all about the cells and the damage you do. And if the glucose load is lowered, more fat can be used as energy instead. Very simple, and very logical. After this they cite some very bad studies that have no relevance at all to the topic. In summary, insulin does inhibit fat loss, but this effect is highly context dependent. When insulin levels are elevated, the body prioritizes glucose metabolism and inhibits lipolysis, thereby reducing fat oxidation. This is backwards thinking 101. It's not the insulin that causes the body to prioritize glucose metabolism, you dimwits. Insulin is released as an emergency response to your blood being flooded by glucose from consuming a highly retarded meal with a load of carbohydrates. So, by the simple laws of logic, it is the consumption of carbohydrates that forces the body into a glucose metabolism, releasing insulin, and it is the high levels of blood glucose that inhibits lipolysis, as in fat oxidation, as that glucose needs to be eliminated as quickly as possible to limit the damage to your organs and soft tissues. Insulin is simply a hormone that is released to aid in this elimination by enabling cells to store glucose as glycogen. Insulin is not inherently a fat-storing hormone, rather, its effects depend on the overall metabolic state and lifestyle factors. A better understanding of how insulin affects fat metabolism can lead to more personalized approaches to weight management and metabolic health. Again, stop focusing on the natural effects of the body, as in the release of insulin, and start focusing on what you actually did to your body to elicit this response, as in poisoning it with carbohydrates and flooding your blood with toxic glucose. Your body is never wrong. It does everything out of survival, to make sure you live for as long as possible and reproduce. Insulin is only a part of that survival response, and focusing on it has absolutely nothing to do with any of the problems caused. We see these misconceptions and retarded thinking in all areas of modern science and medicine, and mostly because of the inverted and backwards thinking science they are taught and conditioned not to question. Luckily, while many of us were taught the same bollocks, we managed to break ourselves free from the indoctrination and return to the basics and logic of physiology and biology, and we will continue to educate and plant seeds. And hopefully, one day, All these lies, deceit, and programming will be exposed, and people can actually start to become healthy again by following our species-specific diet and live our lives according to our physiology. And here's a simple and free tip. If you do not like how your body responds, change the input. The following is a text-to-speech AI chat review of the article Insulin, Glucose Toxicity, and Fat Loss. This article, written by Joachim Bartoll, argues that the conventional understanding of insulin and its role in fat metabolism is fundamentally flawed. Bartoll asserts that humans are designed to primarily utilize fat for energy, and carbohydrates are detrimental to our health, leading to glucose toxicity. He contends that insulin is not a fat-storing hormone, but rather an emergency response mechanism triggered by the consumption of carbohydrates. According to Bartoll, insulin acts to minimize the damage caused by excess glucose in the bloodstream. The author criticizes the scientific community for neglecting the body's natural metabolic processes and instead focusing on insulin as the primary culprit in weight gain and metabolic dysfunction. Briefing Doc, Insulin, Glucose Toxicity, and Fat Loss. Source, excerpts from Insulin, Glucose Toxicity, and Fat Loss by Joachim Bartoll. Main themes. Human physiology. The article asserts that humans are evolutionarily designed for a fat-based metabolism, with ketosis being the normal state. Carbohydrates are viewed as toxic and disruptive to this natural state. Insulin's role. Insulin is not inherently a fat-storing hormone but acts as a critical survival mechanism in response to the ingestion of carbohydrates, which elevate blood glucose to toxic levels. Glucose toxicity. Elevated blood glucose is the primary driver of metabolic dysfunction, causing cellular damage and leading to conditions like insulin resistance and obesity. Backwards thinking. The article criticizes conventional medical and nutritional understanding, arguing that focusing on insulin's role in fat storage is misguided and that the true culprit is carbohydrate consumption. Most important ideas/facts. Fat metabolism as default. Humans are built for running on a fat metabolism and that we are supposed to be in ketosis most of the time and very rarely, if ever, consume toxic carbohydrates. Insulin as a response to toxicity. Insulin is part of the emergency system when you consume carbohydrates. It's an emergency response critical for survival, or the elevated blood glucose from the carbohydrates would kill you. Glucose as the root problem. It has absolutely nothing to do with insulin, or resistance to insulin. It's simply accumulated damage from abusing your body, fueling it with toxic garbage. Cellular damage leading to insulin resistance. What actually happens is, repeated and prolonged elevated blood glucose damages the cells, and as cellular damage accumulates, cells will become unable to store glucose or they would collapse and die. Shifting focus from insulin to glucose. Stop focusing on the natural effects of the body, as in the release of insulin, and start focusing on what you actually did to your body to elicit this response, as in poisoning it with carbohydrates and flooding your blood with toxic glucose. Quotes. On the flawed nature of studies involving carbohydrate consumers. Every single study with someone who is used to consuming carbohydrates becomes flawed and totally worthless. On the body's prioritization of glucose detoxification. It's hardly a surprise that all other energy-giving metabolisms are temporarily shut down to focus all efforts on lowering that toxic glucose. On the true meaning of improved insulin sensitivity. In this sense, improved insulin sensitivity is simply the result of removing some of the toxic glucose load on the body for a time, giving it a chance to heal a little. On the damaging effects of elevated blood glucose. A reduced response to insulin is simply from accumulated damage done to the cells by elevated levels of blood glucose from consuming carbohydrates regularly for long periods of time. Call to action, and here's a simple and free tip. If you do not like how your body responds, change the input. Overall, the article presents a provocative and controversial perspective on insulin's role in fat metabolism, firmly placing the blame on carbohydrate consumption as the root cause of metabolic issues. While the article does not cite specific scientific studies to support its claims, it provides a compelling argument based on an evolutionary and physiological framework. Insulin and fat loss, FAQ. 1. What is insulin's primary role in the body? Insulin is a vital hormone produced by the pancreas that regulates glucose metabolism and energy storage. Its primary function is to help cells absorb glucose from the bloodstream. Cells then use this glucose for energy or store it as glycogen. Insulin is essential for maintaining stable blood sugar levels. 2. Does insulin inhibit fat loss? The relationship between insulin and fat loss is complex. When insulin levels are elevated, the body prioritizes glucose oxidation, burning, over fat oxidation. This means that fat burning is temporarily reduced while the body focuses on processing the influx of glucose. 3. How does insulin affect fat metabolism? One way insulin impacts fat metabolism is by inhibiting lipolysis, the process of breaking down stored fat into free fatty acids for energy. When insulin levels are high, such as after consuming carbohydrates, lipolysis is suppressed. 4. What is the connection between insulin and obesity? Insulin resistance, a condition where cells become less responsive to insulin, is often linked to obesity. In insulin resistance, Higher levels of insulin are needed to process glucose, which can lead to increased fat storage and weight gain. 5. Can insulin sensitivity be improved? Yes, insulin sensitivity can be enhanced through lifestyle modifications such as regular physical activity and weight loss. When insulin sensitivity improves, the body can better regulate blood sugar levels and switch between fat and carbohydrate metabolism more efficiently. 6. Does consuming carbohydrates always lead to fat storage? Not necessarily. While carbohydrate consumption does trigger insulin release, the extent of fat storage depends on various factors, including the type and amount of carbohydrates consumed, overall calorie intake, individual metabolism, and activity levels. 7. What is the author's perspective on the role of carbohydrates in the human diet? The author argues that humans are evolutionarily adapted to thrive on a fat-based metabolism, primarily consuming fat and protein. They believe that carbohydrates are not essential and can be detrimental to health, leading to chronic conditions like diabetes and obesity. 8. What is the main takeaway regarding insulin and fat loss? Insulin plays a crucial role in regulating energy metabolism, and its impact on fat loss is multifaceted. While elevated insulin levels can temporarily suppress fat burning, focusing on overall metabolic health through lifestyle choices like a balanced diet and exercise is key to achieving sustainable fat loss. Understanding insulin's role in fat loss, a deep dive. Source: excerpts from Insulin Glucose Toxicity and Fat Loss by Joachim Bartoll. Introduction: Challenging conventional wisdom on insulin. Summary: this section criticizes the common understanding of insulin's role in fat loss, arguing that mainstream views fail to acknowledge the human body's natural reliance on fat metabolism and the detrimental effects of carbohydrates. 2. Insulin's primary function in a fat-based metabolism. Summary: this section posits that insulin, in its natural state, regulates glucose produced through gluconeogenesis, maintaining a balanced blood sugar level without the need for external carbohydrate intake. 3. The emergency response: insulin and carbohydrate consumption. Summary: this section explains how consuming carbohydrates triggers an unnatural surge in insulin production as the body attempts to manage the resulting toxic influx of glucose, disrupting normal fat metabolism. 4. Debunking the myth of insulin resistance. Summary: this section argues that what is commonly referred to as insulin resistance is actually accumulated cellular damage caused by prolonged exposure to high blood glucose levels, a consequence of consistent carbohydrate consumption. The body's priority: glucose elimination over fat oxidation. Summary: this section explains that the body prioritizes dealing with the immediate threat of elevated blood glucose over utilizing fat as fuel, leading to a temporary shutdown of fat metabolism. 6. Reframing insulin sensitivity. Summary: this section suggests that insulin sensitivity is simply a reflection of the cell's health and their capacity to store glucose as glycogen, emphasizing that cellular damage from glucose overload is the root issue. 7. Weight loss: the impact of reduced glucose load. Summary: this section clarifies that weight loss itself does not improve insulin sensitivity. Rather, the methods employed to achieve weight loss, such as reducing carbohydrate intake and increasing physical activity, lead to lower blood glucose levels, allowing cells to recover and regain their ability to store glucose effectively. 8. Conclusion: shifting the focus from insulin to dietary input. Summary: this section urges a re-evaluation of the focus on insulin, emphasizing the importance of recognizing the detrimental effects of carbohydrate consumption on the body's natural fat metabolism. It calls for a return to a species-specific diet based on fat and protein to achieve optimal health. From the source material which I have uploaded to you, please list 30 takeaway key points with a brief explanation supporting each of the key points. Key takeaways from Joachim Bartoll's Insulin, Glucose Toxicity, and Fat Loss. Here are 30 key points from the provided excerpt of Joachim Bartoll's Insulin, Glucose Toxicity, and Fat Loss with explanations. 1. Humans are built for a fat metabolism and should be in ketosis most of the time. Bartoll asserts that humans are evolutionarily designed to primarily utilize fat for energy, resulting in a state of ketosis. 2. Carbohydrate consumption is unnatural and toxic. Bartoll argues that carbohydrates are not a natural part of the human diet and are detrimental to health. 3. Standard studies on metabolism are flawed due to subjects' carbohydrate consumption. Bartoll believes that research using subjects accustomed to eating carbohydrates is inherently unreliable because their metabolisms are already compromised. 4. Insulin operates on a sliding scale, producing only the amount needed for glucose from gluconeogenesis. Under normal circumstances, Bartoll states that insulin production is finely tuned to manage glucose generated internally. 5. Blood glucose levels remain stable in a fat-based metabolism. When the body relies on fat metabolism and gluconeogenesis, Bartoll claims blood glucose levels stay within a healthy range. 6. Carbohydrate consumption triggers an unnatural surge in insulin. Consuming carbohydrates leads to a dramatic increase in insulin production, which Bartoll views as an abnormal physiological response. 7. Excess glucose from carbohydrates is toxic and damaging to tissues. Bartoll emphasizes the harm caused by high blood glucose levels resulting from carbohydrate intake. 8. Elevated insulin is an emergency response to protect the body from glucose toxicity. Bartoll contends that the insulin spike after carbohydrate consumption is a survival mechanism to cope with the influx of glucose. 9. Diabetes is a consequence of accumulated damage from elevated blood glucose, not insulin resistance. Bartoll posits that diabetes arises from long-term damage caused by high blood sugar, rather than a problem with insulin itself. 10. Cellular damage from glucose leads to an inability to store glucose as glycogen. Bartoll explains that prolonged exposure to high glucose levels impairs cells' capacity to store glucose as glycogen, contributing to persistently elevated blood sugar. 11. Fat metabolism is shut down after carbohydrate consumption to prioritize glucose disposal. Bartoll describes how the body temporarily halts fat burning when blood glucose is high, focusing on eliminating the glucose. 12. Shutting down fat metabolism is a survival mechanism to deal with glucose toxicity. Bartoll emphasizes that inhibiting fat utilization in the presence of high glucose is a necessary measure to minimize damage. 13. Insulin's role is to facilitate glucose uptake, utilization, and storage to protect the body. Bartoll clarifies that insulin's function is to manage the influx of glucose and minimize harm by promoting its uptake and storage. 14. Excess glucose is stored as body fat as part of the survival mechanism. Bartoll explains that storing glucose as fat is a last resort when other methods of glucose disposal are overwhelmed. 15. The body prioritizes glucose oxidation over fat oxidation after carbohydrate consumption. Bartoll reiterates that burning glucose takes precedence over fat burning when blood sugar levels are elevated. 16. Glucose from external sources acts as a poison due to its high concentration. Bartoll highlights the detrimental effects of consuming glucose beyond the body's capacity to regulate it, likening it to poisoning. 17. Improved insulin sensitivity is likely due to reduced glucose load and cellular recovery. Bartoll suggests that the observed improvement in insulin sensitivity is a consequence of lowering glucose levels, allowing cells to heal and regain their ability to store glucose. 18. Exercise and reduced carbohydrate intake contribute to lower glucose levels and cellular repair. Bartoll emphasizes that physical activity and limiting carbohydrates help reduce the burden of glucose on the body, facilitating cell recovery. 19. Bartoll rejects the concept of different genotypes and genetic explanations for metabolic differences. He dismisses the idea of genetic variations affecting metabolic responses, asserting that all humans share the same fundamental blueprint. 20. Reduced insulin response is a result of cellular damage from prolonged high blood glucose. Bartoll argues that cells become less responsive to insulin because of the damage inflicted by consistently elevated blood glucose. 21. Glucose resistance, not insulin resistance, is the accurate term for the phenomenon. Bartoll proposes that the term glucose resistance better reflects the underlying issue of cellular damage and impaired glucose handling. 22. GIP receptor shutdown is a late-stage survival mechanism for cells overwhelmed by glucose. Bartoll explains that the reduced function of the GIP receptor, which stimulates insulin release, is a protective measure taken by damaged cells struggling to cope with glucose overload. 23. Cells may become completely unresponsive to insulin due to glucose-induced damage. Bartoll suggests that in severe cases, the cellular damage from glucose can render cells entirely insensitive to insulin. 24. Obesity is a consequence of accelerated fat storage due to damaged cells' inability to store glucose. Bartoll links obesity to the increased reliance on fat storage as a means of disposing of excess glucose when cells can no longer effectively store it as glycogen. 25. Obese individuals' lower activity levels further contribute to reduced glucose burning. Bartoll points out that reduced physical activity in obese individuals exacerbates the problem of glucose accumulation. 26. Fatty liver results from liver damage caused by prolonged exposure to high blood glucose. Bartoll attributes fatty liver disease to the detrimental effects of sustained elevated blood sugar on the liver. 27. Insulin sensitivity reflects the health and functionality of cells in storing glucose as glycogen. Bartoll emphasizes that the term insulin sensitivity essentially describes the ability of cells to respond to insulin and store glucose appropriately. 28. Weight loss itself does not improve insulin sensitivity, it's the dietary and lifestyle changes that matter. Bartoll clarifies that the benefits associated with weight loss stem from the actions taken to achieve it, such as reducing carbohydrate intake and increasing activity, which directly address the underlying glucose issue. 29. Bartoll criticizes the focus on insulin as the culprit, urging attention to the role of carbohydrates. He argues that the emphasis on insulin's role in fat metabolism distracts from the fundamental problem of excessive carbohydrate consumption. 30. The body's responses, including insulin release, are survival mechanisms in reaction to carbohydrate consumption. Bartoll maintains that the body's reactions, including the release of insulin, are not inherently problematic but are attempts to protect itself from the harmful consequences of ingesting carbohydrates. Please note that these key points represent the views and interpretations of Joachim Bartoll as expressed in the provided source material. It's important to consider these perspectives within a broader context and consult with qualified healthcare professionals for personalized advice. From the source material which I have uploaded to you, please list 30 take-away key points for how I can minimize the probability of becoming diabetic, with a brief explanation supporting each of the key points. Strategies to minimize the risk of diabetes based on Joachim Bartoll's perspective. Here are 30 key takeaways from the provided excerpt, focused on how to minimize the probability of becoming diabetic, along with explanations based on Bartoll's views. 1. Embrace a fat-based metabolism. Prioritize a diet centered around fat and protein, aiming to achieve and maintain a state of ketosis. Bartoll asserts that humans are evolutionarily designed for fat metabolism, making it the natural and healthy state for the body. 2. Minimize or eliminate carbohydrate intake. Severely restrict or completely eliminate carbohydrates from your diet. Bartoll considers carbohydrates unnatural, toxic, and the root cause of metabolic disruptions that lead to diabetes. 3. Understand glucose as a potent toxin. Recognize that glucose, particularly when consumed in excess from external sources, acts like a poison in the body. Bartoll emphasizes the harmful effects of high blood glucose levels on various tissues and organs. 4. View elevated insulin as a protective response, not the problem. Understand that high insulin levels are a necessary response to combat the influx of glucose from carbohydrate consumption. Bartoll argues that focusing on insulin as the culprit distracts from the real issue of excessive glucose. 5. Protect cells from glucose-induced damage. The primary goal is to prevent or minimize damage to cells caused by prolonged exposure to high blood glucose. Bartoll attributes diabetes to the cumulative damage from glucose toxicity. 6. Support cellular repair and recovery. Allow cells to heal and regain their ability to store glucose effectively by reducing the glucose load. Bartoll suggests that what appears as improved insulin sensitivity is actually the result of cellular recovery. 7. Focus on restoring natural glucose regulation. Aim to restore the body's natural ability to regulate glucose levels through fat metabolism and gluconeogenesis. Bartoll emphasizes the importance of aligning with our evolutionary design for metabolic health. 8. Prioritize fat oxidation as the primary energy source. Encourage your body to utilize fat as its primary fuel source by maintaining a low-carbohydrate, high-fat diet. Bartoll believes that this metabolic state is crucial for overall health and disease prevention. 9. Avoid triggering the emergency glucose disposal system. Prevent the need for the body to activate its emergency glucose disposal mechanisms by avoiding the consumption of carbohydrates. Bartoll sees these mechanisms as necessary but ultimately harmful in the long run. 10. Be wary of studies using subjects accustomed to carbohydrates. Critically evaluate research on metabolism and diabetes, considering whether the subjects habitually consume carbohydrates, which Bartoll believes skews the findings. 11. Challenge the concept of insulin resistance. Reconsider the conventional understanding of insulin resistance, recognizing that it might be more accurately described as glucose resistance resulting from cellular damage. 12. Recognize GIP receptor shutdown as a protective measure. Understand that the reduced function of the GIP receptor is a late-stage attempt by damaged cells to protect themselves from further glucose overload, not a primary cause of metabolic dysfunction. 13. Acknowledge the potential for complete cellular unresponsiveness to insulin. Be aware that prolonged exposure to high glucose can severely damage cells, potentially leading to a complete loss of responsiveness to insulin, further complicating glucose regulation. 14. Understand obesity as a consequence of glucose toxicity. View obesity not as the cause but as a result of the body's struggle to cope with excess glucose, leading to increased fat storage. 15. Address underlying metabolic dysfunction, not just weight. Recognize that simply losing weight without addressing the underlying metabolic issues caused by glucose toxicity may not be sufficient to prevent or reverse diabetes. 16. Increase physical activity to enhance glucose utilization. Incorporate regular exercise to increase glucose utilization and improve overall metabolic health. Bartoll acknowledges the role of physical activity in reducing the glucose load. 17. Avoid relying on genetics as an explanation. Don't attribute metabolic differences solely to genetics. Bartoll dismisses the idea of different genotypes playing a significant role, emphasizing the shared human blueprint for metabolism. 18. Focus on lifestyle and dietary interventions. Prioritize lifestyle modifications and dietary changes as the primary means of preventing and managing diabetes. Bartoll sees these as the most effective ways to address the root cause of the problem. 19. Recognize the body's innate drive for survival. Understand that the body's responses, including insulin release, are survival mechanisms aimed at protecting itself from harm. Bartoll urges us to view these responses as adaptive rather than dysfunctional. 20. Empower yourself by changing the input. Take control of your metabolic health by modifying your dietary intake, recognizing that changing the input, food, will inevitably alter the output, health. 21. Understand that fatty liver develops due to excess glucose. Remember that fatty liver disease is a consequence of liver damage caused by prolonged high blood glucose, not necessarily excessive fat intake. 22. Prioritize whole, unprocessed foods. Focus on consuming whole, unprocessed foods, as they are naturally lower in carbohydrates and less likely to trigger the negative metabolic consequences Bartoll describes. This point is implied by Bartoll's emphasis on minimizing carbohydrate intake and prioritizing a natural, fat-based metabolism. Point 23. Be patient and consistent with dietary changes, allow time for your body to adapt to a lower carbohydrate, higher fat diet. Metabolic shifts take time, and consistency is key to achieving lasting results. This advice is implied by Bartoll's focus on long-term dietary patterns rather than quick fixes. Point 24. Monitor your blood glucose levels, regularly check your blood glucose levels to track your progress and identify any potential issues early on. This practice aligns with Bartoll's emphasis on the importance of maintaining stable blood glucose within a healthy range. Point 25. Listen to your body's signals, pay attention to how your body responds to different foods and adjust your diet accordingly. Bartoll encourages individuals to become more attuned to their body's signals and make dietary choices that promote well-being. Point 26. Seek guidance from healthcare professionals knowledgeable about low-carbohydrate diets. Consult with healthcare professionals who understand and support low-carbohydrate approaches to diabetes prevention and management. Bartoll's views may not align with conventional medical advice, so seeking out like-minded practitioners is crucial. Point 27. Be mindful of potential nutrient deficiencies. When drastically reducing carbohydrate intake, ensure you are meeting your nutritional needs through other dietary sources. Bartoll's focus on fat and protein does not explicitly address the importance of a balanced intake of essential vitamins and minerals. Point 28. Recognize that individual responses to diet can vary. Understand that while Bartoll presents a general framework, individual responses to dietary changes can differ. Factors such as genetics, activity level, and overall health status can influence outcomes. Point 29. Avoid extreme or restrictive diets without professional supervision. While Bartoll advocates for minimizing carbohydrates, extreme dietary restrictions should be approached cautiously and with guidance from qualified healthcare professionals. Point 30. Continuously educate yourself about metabolism and nutrition. Stay informed about the latest research and perspectives on metabolism, nutrition, and diabetes prevention. Bartoll encourages individuals to think critically and challenge conventional wisdom. It is important to note that these key takeaways represent Joachim Bartoll's interpretations and opinions as expressed in the provided excerpt. These perspectives should be considered within a broader context, and it is always advisable to consult with qualified healthcare professionals for personalized advice and guidance. According to the author, what is the primary cause of insulin resistance and subsequent health issues? The root of insulin resistance, a perspective from Joachim Bartoll. According to Joachim Bartoll, insulin resistance is not the primary problem but a consequence of prolonged, excessive glucose exposure. He challenges the conventional understanding of insulin resistance, reframing it as glucose resistance stemming from cellular damage. Here's a breakdown of Bartoll's argument. Carbohydrates as the culprit. Bartoll posits that the frequent consumption of carbohydrates, which rapidly break down into glucose, is the root cause of metabolic dysfunction. He views carbohydrates as unnatural for humans, leading to a surge in blood glucose levels that the body must urgently address. Glucose toxicity. Bartoll emphasizes that elevated blood glucose is toxic to cells and tissues. This prolonged exposure to high glucose levels inflicts damage, particularly on cells responsible for storing glucose as glycogen. Cellular damage leading to glucose resistance. As cells accumulate damage from glucose toxicity, their ability to store glucose effectively diminishes. To protect themselves from further harm, these damaged cells become less responsive to insulin, leading to what is commonly termed insulin resistance. GIP receptor shutdown as a last resort. Bartoll highlights the role of the GIP receptor, which stimulates insulin secretion. He suggests that the shutdown of this receptor in damaged cells is a last-ditch effort to limit glucose uptake and prevent further cellular destruction. Obesity as a side effect. In this framework, Bartoll sees obesity not as a cause but as a consequence of the body struggling to cope with excess glucose. As the capacity to store glucose in cells declines, the body increasingly stores it as fat, leading to weight gain. In essence, Bartoll argues that insulin resistance is a symptom, not the disease itself. He places the blame squarely on excessive glucose exposure from carbohydrate consumption as the primary driver of cellular damage and subsequent metabolic dysfunction. He urges a shift in focus from insulin to the real culprit, excessive glucose, to effectively address the root cause of diabetes and related health issues. According to the author, what is the primary function of insulin in the body? Insulin's primary function, a protective response to glucose toxicity. According to the author, Joachim Bartoll, the primary function of insulin is to mitigate the damaging effects of elevated blood glucose, which he attributes mainly to carbohydrate consumption. Bartoll views insulin as a critical component of the body's emergency response system, activated when blood glucose levels rise beyond a safe threshold. Here's a closer look at how Bartoll describes insulin's role. Emergency glucose disposal. Bartoll portrays insulin as a key player in the body's attempt to rapidly clear excess glucose from the bloodstream. He emphasizes that high blood glucose is extremely toxic, requiring swift action to minimize damage to tissues and organs. Facilitating glucose uptake and storage, insulin acts as a signal, enabling cells to absorb glucose from the bloodstream. This glucose can then be used for immediate energy or stored as glycogen in the liver and muscles. Prioritizing glucose oxidation, when insulin levels are high, the body prioritizes burning glucose for fuel over using fat. Bartoll explains that this shift is a survival mechanism to reduce the toxic glucose load as quickly as possible. Promoting fat storage as a last resort, if glucose intake overwhelms the body's capacity to utilize and store it as glycogen, insulin facilitates the conversion of excess glucose into fat for storage. Bartoll views this as a necessary but less ideal outcome, driven by the need to remove glucose from circulation. Bartoll's perspective emphasizes that insulin is not inherently a fat-storing hormone, as it is often portrayed. Instead, he argues that insulin's actions are context-dependent, primarily triggered by the influx of glucose from carbohydrate consumption. Insulin's role, in Bartoll's view, is ultimately protective, aimed at safeguarding the body from the harmful consequences of glucose overload. He suggests that focusing on insulin as the problem distracts from addressing the root cause, the excessive consumption of carbohydrates leading to glucose toxicity. Why does the author argue that the concept of insulin resistance is a misconception? Deconstructing insulin resistance, the author's argument for glucose resistance. The author, Joachim Bartoll, contends that the widely accepted concept of insulin resistance is a misinterpretation of the body's physiological response to chronic carbohydrate consumption. He proposes that the phenomenon should be more accurately termed glucose resistance, emphasizing that cellular damage from excessive glucose exposure is the root cause, not an inherent problem with insulin. Here's a detailed explanation of Bartoll's reasoning. Glucose as the primary offender, Bartoll repeatedly underscores the toxicity of elevated blood glucose levels, primarily stemming from carbohydrate intake. He argues that the body perceives this excess glucose as a threat, triggering an emergency response to mitigate potential damage. Insulin, a reactive, protective mechanism, in Bartoll's view, insulin is not the villain but a crucial player in the body's defense against glucose overload. He describes insulin as a hormone released in response to surging blood glucose levels, aiming to clear this excess glucose as quickly as possible. Cellular damage undermining glucose uptake, Bartoll posits that the repeated assault of high glucose levels inflicts damage on cells, particularly those responsible for storing glucose as glycogen. As these cells become increasingly impaired, their capacity to respond to insulin and absorb glucose diminishes. Glucose resistance as a survival tactic, Bartoll reframes insulin resistance as glucose resistance, suggesting that the reduced cellular response to insulin is a protective mechanism. By limiting glucose uptake, damaged cells attempt to shield themselves from further harm. Shifting the focus from insulin to glucose, Bartoll criticizes the prevailing focus on insulin as the primary driver of metabolic dysfunction. He argues that this emphasis distracts from the real culprit, the chronic influx of glucose from carbohydrate consumption. He urges a paradigm shift to address the root cause, excessive glucose exposure, to effectively tackle diabetes and related health issues. In essence, Bartoll challenges the conventional understanding of insulin resistance, arguing that it misidentifies the problem. He asserts that the reduced cellular response to insulin is not a primary defect but a consequence of prolonged exposure to toxic levels of glucose. He advocates for recognizing glucose resistance as the more accurate term, reflecting the underlying cellular damage caused by excessive carbohydrate consumption. How does the author explain the relationship between insulin and fat metabolism? Insulin's impact on fat metabolism, a protective response to glucose overload. The author, Joachim Bartoll, presents a unique perspective on the relationship between insulin and fat metabolism, arguing that insulin's effects on fat storage and burning are primarily driven by the body's response to elevated blood glucose, which he largely attributes to carbohydrate consumption. He views insulin as a key player in mitigating the harmful effects of excess glucose, influencing fat metabolism as part of this protective effort. Here's how Bartoll explains insulin's impact on fat metabolism. Prioritizing glucose oxidation, Bartoll emphasizes that when blood glucose levels rise, the body prioritizes using glucose for energy over fat. This is a survival mechanism aimed at reducing the toxic glucose load as quickly as possible. Insulin, released in response to this glucose surge, facilitates this shift by promoting glucose uptake and utilization by cells. Inhibiting fat breakdown, lipolysis to further enhance glucose utilization, Bartoll explains that insulin inhibits lipolysis, the process of breaking down stored fat into fatty acids for fuel. By temporarily suppressing fat burning, the body focuses on clearing the excess glucose. Promoting fat storage as a last resort, when glucose intake exceeds the body's capacity to use and store it as glycogen, insulin steps in to facilitate the conversion of this excess glucose into fat for storage. Bartoll views this as a necessary but less desirable outcome, driven by the need to remove glucose from circulation to minimize damage. Bartoll repeatedly stresses that insulin is not inherently a fat-storing hormone. He argues that insulin's actions are context-dependent, primarily triggered by the influx of glucose from carbohydrate consumption. Insulin's role, in his view, is ultimately protective, aimed at safeguarding the body from the harmful consequences of glucose overload. Therefore, according to Bartoll, the relationship between insulin and fat metabolism is not a direct cause and effect but rather a complex interplay influenced by the body's overall metabolic state and, crucially, the level of glucose exposure. He suggests that understanding this nuanced relationship is essential for developing effective approaches to weight management and metabolic health. What does the author argue is the true cause of insulin resistance? Challenging the insulin resistance paradigm, the true culprit according to Joachim Bartoll. Joachim Bartoll argues that the concept of insulin resistance is a misnomer that obscures the true cause of metabolic dysfunction. He contends that the real culprit is not a problem with insulin itself, but the damaging effects of prolonged exposure to elevated blood glucose levels, primarily stemming from carbohydrate consumption. Here's a detailed explanation of Bartoll's argument, drawing on the provided source. Carbohydrates as the root cause. Bartoll consistently emphasizes that the frequent consumption of carbohydrates, which rapidly break down into glucose, is the primary driver of metabolic issues. He sees carbohydrates as unnatural for human physiology, leading to surges in blood glucose that the body struggles to manage. He criticizes the modern society for being deceived into consuming these toxic and cheap carbohydrates, resulting in an extremely unhealthy population. Glucose toxicity as the primary threat. Bartoll repeatedly highlights the toxicity of elevated blood glucose, describing it as extremely toxic and damaging to all soft tissues. He argues that the body perceives this excess glucose as a threat, triggering a cascade of emergency responses to minimize damage. Insulin, a protective response, not the problem. Bartoll challenges the conventional view of insulin as the primary driver of metabolic dysfunction. He portrays insulin as a crucial component of the body's defense against glucose overload, a hormone released in response to surging blood glucose levels to facilitate the removal of this excess glucose from circulation. Cellular damage leading to glucose resistance. Bartoll argues that the repeated assault of high blood glucose levels inflicts damage on cells, particularly those responsible for storing glucose as glycogen. As these cells become impaired, their capacity to respond to insulin and absorb glucose diminishes. This reduced cellular response, often labeled insulin resistance, is, according to Bartoll, a protective mechanism, a form of glucose resistance to shield damaged cells from further harm. GIP receptor shutdown as a last-ditch effort. Bartoll points to the shutdown of the GIP receptor, which stimulates insulin secretion, as further evidence of this protective response. He suggests that this shutdown in damaged cells is a last-ditch effort to limit glucose uptake and prevent further cellular destruction. In essence, Bartoll argues that what is commonly termed insulin resistance is not a primary defect in insulin signaling but a consequence of cellular damage caused by chronic exposure to high levels of glucose. He proposes that the focus should shift from insulin to glucose, recognizing glucose resistance as a more accurate reflection of the underlying problem. He advocates for addressing the root cause, excessive glucose exposure from carbohydrate consumption, to effectively combat diabetes and related health issues. According to the author, what is the primary function of insulin? Insulin's primary function, a protective response against glucose toxicity. According to the author, Joachim Bartoll, the primary function of insulin is to protect the body from the harmful effects of elevated blood glucose levels, which he primarily attributes to carbohydrate consumption. Bartoll views insulin as a key player in the body's emergency response system, mobilized when blood glucose levels rise beyond a safe threshold. Here's a breakdown of how Bartoll describes insulin's protective role, supported by evidence from the source. Countering glucose toxicity. Bartoll repeatedly stresses the toxicity of high blood glucose, stating that it is extremely toxic and damaging to all soft tissues. He argues that the body prioritizes dealing with this threat above all else, as elevated blood glucose needs to be kept in a very narrow range. Emergency glucose disposal. Bartoll portrays insulin as a critical part of this emergency response, released to speed up glucose disposal when carbohydrate consumption leads to a surge in blood glucose. He emphasizes that this is a critical for survival mechanism, as the elevated blood glucose would kill you. Facilitating glucose uptake and storage. Insulin acts as a signal, enabling cells to absorb glucose from the bloodstream. This glucose can be used for energy or stored as glycogen in the liver and muscles. Bartoll explains that this storage function is part of the body's attempt to neutralize the excess glucose and minimize the damage it will cause. Prioritizing glucose oxidation. Bartoll explains that when insulin levels are high, the body prioritizes burning glucose for fuel over fat. He describes this as a necessary step to rapidly lower the toxic glucose load, stating that it would be madness if the body continued to use fat for fuel when it has an abundance of glucose. Promoting fat storage as a last resort. If the influx of glucose overwhelms the body's capacity to utilize and store it as glycogen, insulin facilitates converting this excess glucose into fat for storage. Bartoll views this as a necessary but less ideal outcome, driven by the need to remove glucose from circulation to protect tissues and organs from damage. Bartoll repeatedly emphasizes that insulin is not inherently a fat-storing hormone, as it is often portrayed. He argues that insulin's actions are context-dependent, primarily triggered by and responding to the influx of glucose from carbohydrate consumption. He criticizes the focus on insulin as the problem, stating that it distracts from the root cause, the excessive consumption of carbohydrates leading to glucose toxicity. In summary, Bartoll's perspective underscores that insulin's primary function is a protective one, aimed at safeguarding the body from the damaging consequences of glucose overload, largely driven by carbohydrate consumption. He views the release of insulin as an essential part of the survival mechanism, working to clear excess glucose from the bloodstream and minimize damage to tissues and organs. Why does the author argue that the traditional understanding of insulin's role in fat loss is flawed? Deconstructing the misconception, why insulin's role in fat loss is misunderstood. The author, Joachim Bartoll, argues that the traditional understanding of insulin's role in fat loss is fundamentally flawed because it overlooks the crucial factor of glucose toxicity and misinterprets insulin as the primary driver of fat storage. He criticizes this conventional view as backwards thinking that has led to widespread misconceptions about metabolic health. Here's a detailed explanation of why Bartoll believes this traditional understanding is flawed. Insulin, a reactive, protective hormone, not a fat-storing villain. Bartoll challenges the common perception of insulin as a fat-storing hormone, arguing that this oversimplification ignores the complexity of insulin's actions. He emphasizes that insulin is primarily a protective hormone, released in response to elevated blood glucose levels to mitigate the potential damage caused by this excess glucose. He views insulin as a crucial part of the body's emergency response system, aiming to restore glucose balance and protect tissues from harm. Glucose toxicity, the real culprit in fat storage. Bartoll places the blame for excess fat storage squarely on the excessive consumption of carbohydrates, which rapidly break down into glucose, leading to a surge in blood glucose levels. He repeatedly stresses the toxicity of high blood glucose, describing it as extremely toxic and damaging to all soft tissues. He argues that the body prioritizes clearing this excess glucose above all else, as it poses a direct threat to cellular health and survival. Insulin's actions on fat metabolism are context-dependent. Bartoll explains that insulin's effects on fat metabolism are not direct but rather a consequence of the body's efforts to manage the influx of glucose. He describes how insulin inhibits fat breakdown, lipolysis, to prioritize glucose oxidation, ensuring that the body uses the readily available glucose for fuel instead of burning stored fat. This is a temporary measure to rapidly lower blood glucose levels and minimize damage. Facilitates the conversion of excess glucose into fat for storage when the influx of glucose overwhelms the body's ability to utilize it or store it as glycogen. Bartoll views this as a last resort, a necessary but less desirable outcome driven by the need to remove glucose from circulation to protect tissues. Misinterpreting insulin resistance. Bartoll argues that the concept of insulin resistance, a state where cells become less responsive to insulin, is often misinterpreted as a primary defect in insulin signaling. He contends that this reduced cellular responsiveness is not the root cause but a consequence of the damage inflicted by chronic exposure to high blood glucose levels. He proposes that the more accurate term is glucose resistance, reflecting the underlying cellular damage caused by excessive glucose exposure, which impairs the cell's ability to effectively respond to insulin and take up glucose. In essence, Bartoll argues that the traditional understanding of insulin's role in fat loss is flawed because it places too much emphasis on insulin itself and fails to recognize the central role of glucose toxicity in driving metabolic dysfunction. He advocates for a paradigm shift that focuses on addressing the root cause: excessive glucose exposure from carbohydrate consumption, to improve metabolic health and facilitate fat loss. How does the author explain the connection between glucose and cellular damage? Glucose as a cellular saboteur, unpacking the link between glucose and cellular damage. The author, Joachim Bartoll, posits a strong connection between elevated blood glucose levels and cellular damage, a concept he refers to as glucose toxicity. He argues that this damage, primarily stemming from excessive carbohydrate consumption, is the true culprit behind metabolic disorders, often misattributed to insulin resistance. Here's a comprehensive explanation of how the author connects glucose to cellular damage. Carbohydrates as the source of excess glucose. Bartoll emphasizes that frequent carbohydrate consumption leads to surges in blood glucose, as carbohydrates rapidly break down into glucose during digestion. He views this as an unnatural state for the human body, designed to primarily run on a fat metabolism. Elevated blood glucose, a toxic threat. Bartoll consistently portrays elevated blood glucose as a dangerous toxin, stating that blood glucose is extremely toxic and damaging to all soft tissues. He argues that the body perceives this excess glucose as a threat, triggering a cascade of emergency responses to minimize damage. Cellular damage as a consequence of glucose overload. Bartoll argues that the constant exposure to high levels of blood glucose inflicts damage on cells, particularly those responsible for storing glucose as glycogen. He explains that the cellular damage is the true cause of what is commonly mislabeled as insulin resistance, which he prefers to call glucose resistance. Glucose resistance as a protective mechanism, Bartoll suggests that this reduced responsiveness to insulin, often observed in metabolic disorders, is not a primary defect but a protective mechanism adopted by damaged cells to limit further glucose uptake and prevent their own destruction. This glucose resistance is a last-ditch effort to shield already compromised cells from the continued assault of high glucose levels. GIP receptor shutdown, a sign of cellular distress, Bartoll points to the shutdown of the GIP receptor, which normally stimulates insulin secretion, as further evidence of cellular damage. He suggests that this shutdown, observed in cells chronically exposed to high glucose, is a sign of cellular distress, a last-ditch effort to prevent further glucose uptake and minimize damage. Cellular damage undermining metabolic function, Bartoll describes how the cumulative damage from prolonged glucose exposure leads to a decline in metabolic function. Cells become less efficient at storing glucose as glycogen, leading to persistently elevated blood glucose levels and further exacerbating the problem. This cycle of damage and dysfunction contributes to the development of metabolic disorders. Bartoll's perspective highlights that glucose, when consistently elevated due to excessive carbohydrate consumption, acts as a cellular saboteur, inflicting damage that disrupts metabolic processes and contributes to the development of chronic health issues. He urges a shift in focus from insulin resistance to glucose resistance to accurately reflect the underlying problem and address the root cause, the overconsumption of carbohydrates and the resulting glucose toxicity. What are the author's arguments against the common idea that insulin inhibits fat loss? Dismantling the insulin fat loss myth, a reframing of metabolic processes. The author, Joachim Bartoll, challenges the common notion that insulin directly inhibits fat loss. He argues that this oversimplification misrepresents the complex interplay between glucose, insulin, and fat metabolism. Instead, he proposes a paradigm shift that recognizes glucose toxicity as the central driver of metabolic dysfunction, with insulin acting as a protective response rather than a fat-storing villain. Here's a breakdown of Bartoll's key arguments against the idea that insulin inhibits fat loss. Insulin's role is reactive, not proactive. Bartoll repeatedly emphasizes that insulin is not inherently a fat-storing hormone. Its release is triggered by elevated blood glucose levels, primarily stemming from carbohydrate consumption. Insulin acts as a messenger, signaling cells to absorb glucose from the bloodstream, prioritizing its use for energy or storage. Prioritizing glucose clearance for survival, Bartoll contends that the body perceives high blood glucose as a toxic threat and prioritizes its removal to minimize